The air in Lecture Hall 7 of the Zalosian Institute for Advanced Galactic Studies hummed with the soft, interlocking chimes of 1,000 circulating climate crystals. Light filtered through the hall's vaulted, living quartz ceiling, refracted into soft rainbows that danced across the floating obsidian lecture pods where my students were seated. From my position at the central lectern, Professor Kalin, surveyed their varied forms. There was Vrex, a young Grisk warrior caste student, his crimson carapace polished to a high sheen, his multifaceted eyes blinking in slow, arrogant succession. He believed strength was measured in kilotons of force and the tensile integrity of one's armor. To his left hovered Unit 734, a representative of the Lore Collective, its featureless chrome angel body a stark contrast to the organic chaos of the rest of the class. It perceived existence as a series of cascading data streams to be optimized for maximum efficiency. Beside it, the Plianth scholar, Lyra, adjusted a nutrient tube connected to her pod. Her broad, leaf-like appendages, which served as both sensory organs and expressions of emotion, were a calm, verdant green, betraying a placid curiosity. They were the best and brightest of their generation, gathered from across the 64 core systems of the Galactic Concordance. They had studied stellar engineering, xenoeconomics, and the intricate dance of interspecies diplomacy. Today, however, was the capstone lecture for my course on advanced strategic studies. The topic was one that was rarely discussed in detail, often relegated to a footnote in more sanitized political histories. I activated the main holographic display with a gesture of my three-fingered hand. Crystalline dust motes swirled in the air, coalescing into the formal sigil of the Concordance. "Greetings, scholars," I began, my voice resonating with the low, resonant frequency of my species. "Today we will be examining Clause 7, Section 12 of the Galactic Concordance on Interstellar Warfare, commonly and somewhat crudely known as the Terran Injunction." A low murmur rippled through the hall. Vrex shifted in his pod, his massive claws tapping an impatient rhythm. "Professor," he clicked, his voice a gravelly subharmonic. "With respect, the Terran Injunction is a foundational tenet. We have known of it since our primary schooling. Humans are not to be engaged, solicited, or otherwise involved in any sanctioned stellar conflict. It is a simple prohibition. Is a full lecture necessary to analyze what amounts to a protectionist policy for a minor, soft-shelled species?" His sentiment was common. Humans, or Terrans as they were officially designated, were an anomaly. In a galaxy populated by beings with endoskeletons of woven carbon, carapaces that could withstand small arms fire, or forms composed of pure energy, the humans were fragile. They were bipedal sacks of water and protein, distressingly vulnerable to radiation, temperature fluctuations, and kinetic impact. Their homeworld Earth was a chaotic mess of seismic instability and extreme weather, a death world by most classifications, yet the beings it produced seemed almost laughably unequipped for survival. They were perceived by the wider galaxy as clever, creative, and emotionally volatile, but ultimately physically unimposing. They were poets, artists, and traders, not warriors. "An excellent point, Vrex," I replied, allowing a thin, knowing smile to touch my crystalline features. "The simplicity of the clause is deceptive. You assume it is a policy designed to protect humanity. This is a fundamental, and I assure you, a very dangerous misunderstanding. The injunction is not for their protection. It is for ours." The hall fell silent. Even Unit 734 paused its incessant microcalculations, its internal processors likely re-evaluating baseline assumptions. Lyra's leaves tilted slightly, a sign of deepening intrigue. "To understand," I continued, "we must erase our preconceptions. We must look past the frail physiology and examine the species through the lens of history. Not their curated histories they present to the galaxy, filled with art festivals and scientific breakthroughs, but the raw, unfiltered data logs of their conflicts. The Concordance archives these records under the highest security classifications for a reason." I dimmed the ambient light and enlarged the hollow display. "Our first case study is what the archives refer to as the Rylac Scuffle. It occurred less than a century after humanity achieved interstellar travel, when they had established only a handful of extrasolar colonies. The Rylac, as some of you may know from your history texts, were an insectoid species, driven by a rigid caste system and a culture that glorified opportunistic raiding. They were, for lack of a better term, pirates. An archival image appeared, A Rylak warrior, tall and spindly with chitinous plates and 4 razor-sharp limbs, towering over a grainy image of a human colonist in a simple pressure suit. Rylak perceived the new human colony on a world they called Elysium as an easy target, I narrated. A soft source of refined metals, technology, and biological nourishment. They descended upon the colony with a force of 10,000 warriors, expecting to meet token resistance from a few hundred colonists, then strip the settlement bare. Standard Rylak doctrine. Vrex let out a low, chuffing sound, a brisk version of a laugh. A predictable outcome, Professor. 10,000 warriors against a few hundred farmers. Indeed, I said, predictable. Just not in the way you imagine. I brought up a new file, a tactical log from the Rylak attack fleet. It was a chaotic mess of confused communications and escalating panic. The Rylak landed, expecting fear. They were met with coordinated fury. The colonists, these soft-shelled farmers, had converted their agricultural equipment into weapons. Crop dusters became delivery systems for corrosive fertilizer. Laser plows were mounted on transports and turned into crude beam cannons. They dug trenches, created kill zones, and used their intimate knowledge of the planet's terrain to lead the Rylak into ambushes. They fought with a ferocity that the Rylak, whose entire culture was based on combat, found utterly baffling. The log showed that after 3 days of brutal, close-quarters fighting, the Rylak raiding party had been annihilated, not repelled. Annihilated, over 9,000 Rylak casualties for the loss of 73 human colonists. An impressive defense, Vrex conceded, his arrogance momentarily checked. But a desperate defense is not a reason to ban an entire species from warfare. Correct, Vrex. What happened next is the reason. A standard concordance response to such an attack would be punitive. A fleet would be dispatched to the Rylak homeworld. We would bombard their primary military installation, enforce a trade embargo, and demand reparations. The conflict would be resolved. That is not the human method. I pulled up a new set of files. Economic charts, sociological analyses, linguistic decryptions. The human response was not military, not at first. They dispatched a vessel, yes, but it was not a warship. It was a research vessel. On board were not soldiers, but sociologists, economists, xenobotanists, and historians. For an entire year, they blockaded the Rylak system and simply studied them. They scanned their world, intercepted their communications, analyzed their planetary resources, and pieced together their history. Unit 734 words softly. Query, for what purpose? Retaliatory targeting data. No, Unit 734, I said, turning to the sleek machine. For a diagnosis. Humans approached the Rylak raid not as an act of war, but as a symptom of a disease. Their diagnosis was this. Rylak society was predicated on raiding because their homeworld was nutrient-poor and their agricultural technology was primitive. Their culture of martial glory was a societal coping mechanism for systemic poverty. A stunned silence filled the hall. Lyra's leaves had begun to curl at the edges, a sign of unease. The humans didn't want to punish the Rylak, I explained. They wanted to cure them. They broke the blockade and offered a trade. In exchange for the Rylak's complete and total disarmament, humanity would terraform 3 of the Rylak homeworld's continents. They introduced genetically engineered crops that could thrive in the planet's acidic soil. They provided educational programs, broadcast directly into Rylak hives that restructured their caste system, replacing the warrior caste with engineer and biologist castes. They rewrote their history, reframing their ancient figures not as great raiders, but as foolish leaders who condemned their people to needless poverty. The holo display now showed the Rylak homeworld a generation later. Green, lush continents replaced the barren rock. Rylak hives, once grim fortresses, were now clean, efficient centers of agricultural production. The Rylak themselves, once feared pirates, were now a docile, productive junior partner in a human-led trade alliance. They were peaceful, they were prosperous, and their original culture, the songs, the epics of glorious raids, the very concept of a warrior was gone. It existed only in human anthropological archives. They didn't defeat the Rylak, Lyra whispered, her voice trembling. They erased them. They replaced them with something else. Precisely, Lyra, I affirmed. To a human, a defeated enemy is a future threat. An enemy that has been fundamentally changed, whose entire reason for fighting has been surgically removed from their culture, is no longer an enemy. It is a resource. This is the first principle of human conflict. It is not about destruction. It is about total systemic transformation. They don't just win the war, They win the peace that follows on their terms. Are you beginning to see why the injunction exists? Before anyone could answer, I transitioned the display. Our second case is more severe. It concerns the Cathar theocracy. The image that formed was of a Cathar zealot. A towering leonine biped with burning, intelligent eyes and ornate, powered armor inscribed with religious iconography. The Cathar were a species driven by absolute faith. Their holy writ, the canon of a billion stars, proclaimed that all life in the galaxy must embrace their truth or be purged as cosmic heresy. They were expanding, converting, or conquering worlds with the unshakable fervor of believers. When they reached the borders of a human sector, they did not offer terms. They issued a divine ultimatum: convert to the Cathar faith or face holy annihilation. Conflict of ideology, Unit 734 stated. Such conflicts are historically intractable, often resulting in centuries of attrition-based warfare. Correct, I agreed. The Concordance projected a 200-year war with trillions of casualties, culminating in a bitter stalemate. Humanity resolved it in 5 years, and they barely fired a shot. Vrex leaned forward, his mandibles parted in disbelief. Impossible. A species like the Cathar would not yield to anything less than overwhelming force. Humans understand that a belief system is not a fortress to be shattered, but a foundation that can be undermined, I countered, my voice low and grim. Their initial response was, as expected, military. They met the Cathar crusade at the border and fought a brilliant defensive campaign. Their adaptability was terrifying. Cathar tactics that worked once never worked a second time. Human fleets were fluid, unpredictable, sacrificing ships and worlds strategically to draw the Cathar deeper into their territory, stretching their supply lines and bogging down their invincible holy armada. The real war was not fought in space. It was fought in the minds of the Cathar themselves. While their fleets were being bled dry in tactical feints, human linguistics and theology AIs were performing a complete deconstruction of the canon of a billion stars. They cross-referenced its prophecies with galactic astronomical charts, revealing them to be based on primitive, pre-spaceflight observations. They found textual inconsistencies, historical fabrications, and logical paradoxes within the scripture. They discovered that the Cathar's most revered prophet was, according to their own historical records, biologically incapable of making the pilgrimage the scriptures described. I gestured to the display, which now showed a stream of human propaganda. But it wasn't crude posters or threats. It was calm, academic. They didn't broadcast insults, they broadcast questions. They sent short, simple, Socratic messages to Cathar ships and colonies. If the first prophet was born on a methane world, how did he cross the sea of fire as described in verse 3? The canon states the 9 hells are located in the Xylos Nebula, but our telescopes show this is a stellar nursery. Can you clarify? Your scripture says non-believers are soulless, yet we have rescued your wounded and treated them. We feel grief for our dead. How is this so? Simultaneously, they established re-education centers on neutral worlds for captured Cathar soldiers. They were not prisons, they were universities. The Cathar were given access to all of human knowledge, science, philosophy, art, history. They were encouraged to debate, to question, to think for themselves. The humans didn't tell them their religion was wrong. They gave them the tools to discover it on their own. The display showed a video log. A Cathar zealot, a fearsome warrior, was sitting in a simple room, tears streaming from his feline eyes as he read a human book on evolutionary biology. The foundation of his entire existence was crumbling. The result was catastrophic for the Cathar, I stated, my voice a solemn knell. The Cathar crusade didn't just halt, it collapsed from within. A schism erupted, then a civil war. The reformers, armed with human logic and evidence, waged an ideological war against the orthodox. The human fleet just watched, providing humanitarian aid to all sides. Within a single generation, the Cathar theocracy was history. The canon of a billion stars is now studied as a piece of classical mythology. The Cathar are a secular, fractured people, locked in a perpetual and bitter philosophical debate with themselves. They will never threaten the galaxy again. They are too busy arguing over the nature of the soul their conquerors taught them they might not even have. The lecture hall was now thick with a heavy, profound silence. Lyra was visibly wilting, her leaves a sickly pale green. The scent of ozone and distressed flora filled the air around her pod. Vrex was staring at the display, his crimson carapace seeming darker in the dim light. The arrogant warrior was gone, replaced by a soldier who was beginning to understand the nature of a battle he could never win. Unit 734 spoke, its voice devoid of its usual clinical detachment. It sounded for the first time disturbed. The human methodology is absolute. The Rylak conflict demonstrated a restructuring of the socio-economic sphere. The Cathar conflict demonstrates a restructuring of the ideological sphere. They do not leave an enemy capable of resuming the conflict. They excise the very casus belli from the enemy's civilization. Yes, I said softly, and that brings us to our final and most terrifying example. The one that led directly to the signing of the injunction. We call it the Silent War. Their opponent was the Cygnian ascendancy. I let the name hang in the air. Even centuries later, it invoked a primal fear in most species. I brought up an image of a Cygnian. It was beautiful and horrifying. A creature of living metal and crystal, perfectly symmetrical with no discernible face or organs. They were a hive intelligence, but not a collective like the lore. They were a single, vast, distributed consciousness. They did not communicate, they did not negotiate, they expanded. They saw all organic life not as sentient, but as disorganized matter, a resource to be broken down and assimilated into their own perfect, silent form. The Cygnians were not evil. They were a force of nature, like a black hole or a supernova. When they began encroaching on the Perseus arm, the Concordance fleet met them. It was a slaughter. Our weapons were ineffective against their shifting, adaptive hulls. Our strategies were transparent to their distributed intelligence. The Concordance Council was preparing for the worst, the seeding of 2 full galactic quadrants and the creation of a permanent, ever-shrinking buffer zone. It was deemed the only logical response to an unwinnable war. Vrex looked at me, his multifaceted eyes wide with a dawning horror. The humans, they fought them. They were asked not to, I replied. The Concordance begged them to evacuate their colonies in the Cygnian path. It was seen as a foregone conclusion. The humans, of course, politely refused. What followed was not a war in any sense we understood it. It was a pest extermination. The holographic display shifted to star charts, dotted with grim, red icons. Humans knew they could not defeat the Cygnians in conventional combat. Their analysis showed that a direct confrontation was, as Unit 734 would say, inefficient. So they did not attack the Cygnian fleets. They attacked the Cygnians' nature. They analyzed their biology, their method of replication, their energy requirements, and they found a vulnerability. Cygnians, for all their power, were exquisitely specialized. They required 22 specific rare Earth elements and a narrow band of stellar radiation to replicate. They terraformed worlds into crystalline gardens that produced these resources for them. So the humans didn't bomb those worlds. My voice dropped to a near whisper. They poisoned them. They created a self-replicating, gray goo-style nanite plague, not one that attacked the Cygnians, but one that attacked the minerals they fed on. The nanites were designed to be inert until exposed to Cygnian energy signatures. Then, they would activate and catalyze the 22 essential elements into inert, useless isotopes. They launched these nanite clouds, disguised as comets, into the hearts of the Cygnian-held systems. The display showed a simulation. A Cygnian fleet, beautiful and terrible, lands on a world they have spent decades preparing. They begin to draw energy and resources, and the world dies beneath them. The very ground becomes poison to them. Their crystalline gardens crumble to dust. Their fleets, starved of fuel, drift silently in space. They didn't just fight the Cygnian army, I stated, my own voice tight with the memory of the reports. They destroyed their fields, they salted their earth. They turned their entire territory into a galactic desert, a graveyard where they could no longer live. That, I said, looking around the horrified room, was not the part that led to the injunction. That was merely the setup. The final act was what sealed humanity's fate in the galactic community. Surviving Cygnian fleets, starving and unable to replicate, began a desperate retreat, trying to find a region of space untainted by the human nanites. The humans pursued them, not to destroy them but to capture a specimen. They sacrificed an entire fleet to corner and seize a single damaged Cygnian bioship. What purpose? Lyra asked, her voice a fragile wisp of sound. I looked at her, my ancient heart heavy with the weight of the knowledge. You see, humans have a concept they call total war. We have it too, but our definition is different. For us, it means committing all military resources to a conflict. For humans, it means committing all resources of their civilization. Their science, their art, their philosophy, their industry, everything is turned into a weapon. Biologists, their geneticists, their AI specialists, the greatest minds of their species, studied the captured Cygnian. And they engineered a second plague. This one was not a nanite, it was a retrovirus, a biological agent of impossible complexity designed to target the unique quantum-entangled consciousness of the Cygnian hive mind. It killed them? Vrex asked, his voice barely audible. No, I said. It was so much worse. Death is an end. This was a rewriting. The virus didn't kill the Cygnians. It severed their connection to the hive mind. It gave each individual Cygnian ship, each fragment of the once great ascendancy, a horrifying new gift. Self-awareness, individuality, consciousness. The display showed the final transmission from the human task force commander, a woman named Admiral Eva Rostova. Her face was grim, her eyes ancient, filled with a terrible resolve. We can't kill a concept, she said, her voice calm and steady. But we can introduce a competing one. We've given them mortality, we've given them fear, we've given them a self. They are no longer a single oncoming storm. They are now a billion terrified, lonely voices crying out in the dark. I shut off the display. The hall was plunged into near darkness, the only light coming from the pale glow of the students' pods. The silence was absolute, a heavy blanket of shared understanding and terror. Cygnian ascendancy is gone, I told them. In its place are a billion sentient, immortal, and utterly insane individuals, trapped in bodies they can no longer control, screaming in the silent void. They are no threat, they are a monument to human problem-solving. I raised the light slowly. I saw their faces. Vrex's warrior pride was shattered, replaced by a profound, respectful fear. Lyra was weeping silently, her leaves shedding dew-like tears of empathy for a species she had been taught to dread. Unit 734 was motionless, perhaps trapped in a logic loop, unable to process a solution that was both perfectly efficient and infinitely cruel. Now do you understand? I asked them, my voice echoing in the vast hall. This is why we have the Terran injunction. We do not fear that humanity will lose a war. We fear that they will win. We are all, in our own way, rigid. The Grisk are defined by honor, the Lore by logic, my own people by tradition, the Cathar by faith. We can be broken, we can be defeated, but we remain ourselves. Do not break their enemies, they repurpose them. They approach conflict like a disease, they don't just treat the symptoms. They analyze the pathogen, sequence its genome, and engineer a tailored cure that not only eradicates the illness, but rewrites the patient's biology to ensure no similar disease can ever take root. They develop antibodies. For piracy, the antibody was economic restructuring. For religious fanaticism, it was philosophical deconstruction. For an existential predator, it was forced sentience. I let that sink in. The Terran injunction is a quarantine, I said finally, looking each of my students in the eye. Not of a species, but of a way of thinking. A way of total, absolute, and terrifyingly permanent problem-solving. We ban them from our wars not because we are afraid they will commit genocide. We are afraid they will look at the chaos and aggression inherent in a galaxy of competing species, diagnose it as a sickness, and decide to cure us. Vrex finally spoke, his voice low and humbled. So we don't ban them from our conflicts to protect them from us. No, young Vrex, I concluded, as the chimes signaling the end of the lecture began to sound. We ban them to protect us, our cultures, our beliefs, our very identities from them. Students left in silence, the usual post-lecture chatter absent. They were no longer just scholars. They were now custodians of a truth far more complex and frightening than any equation or battle plan. And as I watched them go, I was left with the same question that the Concordance Council has debated in secret for 2 centuries. What galactic-level threat could ever become so dire, so utterly insurmountable, that we would be forced to rescind the injunction and unleash humanity upon the galaxy? And what, in God's name, would be left of us when they were done?